Welcome to the Conversation Lab. I'm Don Schaefer. If democracy begins in conversation, then we need to nurture a culture where ordinary people like us routinely talk about those things that help us understand each other, whether it's about climate, race, religion, gender, or politics. When we're trying to make sense of our city and the world we live in, every question comes with a set of assumptions about the nature of ourselves and our place in a larger world. The Conversation Lab provides a safe place to talk about some of those things. This program is produced by CFRO-FM in Vancouver. It's available on air and online on various platforms, and we appreciate the help of Vancouver's community groups. Jen Lyle is the Chief Executive Officer of the Alzheimer's Society of British Columbia. She's the former CEO of Safe Care BC and brings a wealth of knowledge and experience in the nonprofit, health, and continuing care sectors. Hi, Jen.
Hey, Don, how are you?
I'm pretty good, thank you. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. Nice to put a face to an email.
Yeah, it is, absolutely. Thanks for taking the time to join us. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
I was looking at your bio and I thought, boy, talk about changing jobs at a strange time in history. What's that been like for you?
It's been really interesting. And I think somebody asked me the same question the other day, and I was like, you know what? I feel like I saw a lot throughout the course of the pandemic in my previous work, just in terms of some of the decisions that were being made, the policy, the pressures that the system was under. And when I saw the opportunity come up with the Alzheimer's Society BC, I thought this is perfect because it allows me an opportunity to share what I've observed and maybe help promote a little more system level change going forward. So I know a lot of people say we really hope that what we've learned from the pandemic, we can actually apply in lessons going forward. And I feel like I'm fortunate in some ways to have the experience to be able to try and apply that.
I really want to spend time talking about the Alzheimer's Society, but I'm really curious about the not-for-profit sector. And based on your experience, what's changed because of the pandemic?
It's interesting. I think some things have changed and some things have remained the same. So I think that the broader trend that we were seeing around people identifying with the cause, that's been accelerated perhaps by the pandemic, but I wouldn't say that that's a major change because increasingly what we're seeing is people who want to donate, people who want to volunteer their time, they're identifying with a cause, not necessarily a brand. So I think that's a trend that was already underway and that's come through. What I think the pandemic has significantly changed though is just our broad adoption of technology. And that's a really interesting opportunity because it, like for us here at the Alzheimer's Society BC, it impacts how we work, like how our team works together, but it also impacts how we serve our mission. And I think there's some really cool opportunities there that allow us to reach more people that we otherwise wouldn't have been able to engage with. I'm thinking like, you know, the climb for Alzheimer's is a great example of that, where this past fall, we ran the climb as a hybrid event. We'd never done that before. So we had an opportunity for people to climb a local mountain or come do the grouse grind with us. But it was just a way to engage the entirety of the province in a way that we hadn't done before. So I think that's a sector trend that everybody's facing. I also think that and this maybe is related to the pandemic in that we saw significant supply chain constraints and that's impacted inflation. But we know that that's impacted markets, which then has a knock-on effect and impacting donor behavior. Because when the markets aren't doing well and when interest rates are high, people are less likely to donate their money, understandably so, because they're watching what's happening and maybe they don't want to, liquidate those shares and take the cash and donate it to something. So those are some headwinds that I think the charitable sector more broadly is facing. But it's a really interesting time to be in this sector because you are at all these different transition points coming out of the pandemic. And for better or for worse, those transition points offer us an opportunity to change.
Probably around the same time you joined the Alzheimer's Society, I saw an article in the Globe and Mail where as many as 50% of the not-for-profit charities in Canada would likely close their doors or become part of larger organizations. Have you seen any of that?
It's really interesting because I think it depends on what sector you're in. Because one of the things that we saw during the pandemic is that any charity that was associated with healthcare or social services in some way, shape, or form In some cases, a lot of those organizations saw greater donations than they otherwise would have, because you think about how all of us experienced the first few months of the pandemic. We were locked down. There's that feeling of powerlessness, of like, I can't do anything. So what happened is a lot of people turned that sense of powerlessness, and they sought agency. And one of the ways they did that is like, okay, there's this great organization out here that's helping seniors. I'm going to donate to that organization. So I don't think everybody's experience across the charitable sector was consistent. I do know that for charities that were particularly reliant on in-person event-based fundraising, it was really hard, because obviously you can't have the big 200-person gala dinner. So you had to think really creatively around how you're going to do that. But I would say it's, I have no doubt that it was tough for some charities, but not all. And I think that's the interesting thing that's happened coming out of the pandemic.
It's a great way to look at it. I'm curious, what drew you to Alzheimer's?
So a little bit of a personal connection and a professional one. So when people try and untangle what my professional background is, I like to jokingly say I'm a bit of a mutt. But the one common thread is that I've always had an interest in working with older adults. So whether it's through research, or whether it's through working as a clinician in the community, whether it's how what jobs I choose and volunteer roles I pick, it's always been, I'm a bit of a sucker for an underdog, I guess you could say, because I find that on the whole, one of the things that's still one of the few acceptable isms we still have is ageism. So there's sort of a professional passion around that, but I also have a personal connection to Alzheimer's disease. I have two family members who've been impacted by dementia. One of them was my uncle. He passed away last year. And then we have another family member who's currently living with Alzheimer's disease. So it's just seeing that up close and personal, it changes you, right? It gives you a different perspective as to what people go through. And so I'm just really fortunate to be one of the people who could find a job that aligned with my professional passion, but also my personal one.
Can you tell us a bit about the Alzheimer's Society?
So the Alzheimer's Society BC is a not-for-profit charity. And basically what we are really driving for is to create a dementia-friendly BC. And what that means is that people who are living with dementia, their family members, they live in communities where they're welcomed, where they're supported, and where they're included. So that's really the bread and butter of what we're all about. And we drive at that in a couple of different ways. So for example, First Link is probably one of our best known programs, and we provide direct support and education to families and people living with dementia. Whether it's a support group, whether it's workshops, whether it's things like Minds in Motion. So we have the programs and support services side of things. We also do advocacy work. And I like to kind of characterize that as sort of the capital A advocacy, where we're talking about advocating for change in the healthcare system and in the legislation and in people's recognition of human rights and that sort of thing. But there's also the lowercase advocacy, which is really sort of our community focused work, where we talk about how you, as a person in your community, can help your next door neighbor, or help the person at work, or how you can be somebody who can be that person to be supportive of people living in your community who are living with dementia. And sometimes it also means working with businesses. So, helping a bank figure out how to be dementia friendly, or helping the local restaurant figure out how they can design their approach or train their staff on how to be dementia friendly. So that's kind of the lowercase advocacy stuff that we do. And then, of course, we work on raising awareness, and we invest and we help inform research. So those are sort of the four different buckets that we're active in.
I'm curious, what kind of changes are you trying to push forward?
I think an obvious one is some of the work that we embarked on a few months ago, actually, around how family members are seen or not seen as part of the care team when it comes to long-term care. We know from firsthand experience and all the stories that we heard, I know this personally, what it felt like to be a family member living throughout the pandemic and being unable to see your family member, your loved one, in care. And so those sorts of system level changes, where we talk about fundamentally reframing how family members are seen as part of the care team, not an extra, not a nice to have, but a necessity to ensure that the person who's living with dementia is supported and they have a good quality of life. Those are some of the changes that we're advocating for. We've been working across the Federation. So we work with other Alzheimer's societies across Canada to look at things like the national standards in long-term care, but also things around even just recognizing that people living with dementia have the right to make decisions for themselves. So we've been partnering with groups like, for example, the Canadian Centre for Elder Law, looking at supportive decision making, which is really important because a lot of times what happens is people who have a diagnosis of dementia have a lot of decisions taken away from them, even if they're still capable of making them, or even if they could make them, if they had a little extra support or help. So those are sort of the changes that we're looking at. And I put those in sort of the capital A advocacy bucket, so to speak.
I'm not sure how to ask this question, but how do we deal with those difficult questions that we often get asked? How do you establish what's the difference between mild cognitive impairment and dementia? How do we have these conversations amongst ourselves and with our family?
It's a great question. And I think so. The first piece of advice I give people whenever they have a question about, like, what about for my family or my situation, I tell them call the dementia helpline at the Alzheimer's Society BC. Like, whatever the specifics are that you're dealing with, give us a call. It's a free service. It's a 1-800 number, so you don't even have to worry about paying for the phone fare. But like, that's just so critically important to have the information at your fingertips. And you don't have to figure this out on your own. We have people who can help you out. And the number there is just 1-800-936-6033. But I think more broadly, you've hit on an interesting point because, so for one, if you're experiencing any form of changes to your memory or you feel like something's a little off, your first step's always to go to your family doctor if you have one. And I think that's a challenge that we know right now, right? Like, access to primary care is a big hurdle for a lot of people. But your first step is to go to your family doctor. And then you will typically go through a series of tests to identify, okay, what's happening? Is this dementia or is it something else? Because sometimes it's not. Is this dementia? What is your level of cognitive function? And what things do we need to start thinking about now to plan for the future? So that's sort of your first step. But I think even before that, what we find is some people are reluctant to even go seek a diagnosis because there's so much stigma associated around having that label. And it's really interesting because we just did a survey with Leger Canada recently, and we found that about half of British Columbians believe that once you get that diagnosis of dementia, that's the end of a meaningful life for you. And we know that that's just categorically not true. I've got plenty of examples. I can think of a number of people off the top of my head who have very rich and purpose-filled lives, and they are living with dementia. And I think that's part of why we're so reluctant to engage in some of these conversations is the stigma around it. And then couple that with challenges accessing primary care, and you can understand why people don't always go out and they seek a diagnosis. And the stats bear us out. I mean, we know that we've got 70,000 British Columbians who are diagnosed with dementia, but we also know that about 60% of Canadians who are living with dementia don't have a diagnosis.
So how do you know if you have dementia?
So there's a difference between normal memory lapses and changes in behavior, significant memory lapses, changes in decision making. One of the examples I use sometimes is we've all had that situation where we've parked our car in the mall and we can't remember exactly where we parked a car. That's in the normal bucket. But if you drive to the mall, you park your car, and then you walk home because you forgot that you actually drove your car to the mall, that's not normal. That's when you want to go out and seek some help. The other thing that sometimes we see is changes in personality. So I'm thinking of one situation, two sisters, where sort of the thing that twigged one of the sisters to the fact that their sister was going through something a little bit different was the fact that their personality changed. They were more weepy, they were more anxious, they were just out of character. And so that was kind of the trigger for them to go and say, hey, you know what, I think you should see your family doctor and get this checked out. But that's kind of the mainstay of it is, you know, there's normal forgetting things, and then there's forgetting I drove my car to the mall and walking home. There's normal mood swings, and then there's out of character personality changes. There's normal decision making, and then there's unusual decisions that people otherwise wouldn't make. That's when you want to start asking those questions around, is everything okay? Why don't you go see your family doctor? And then you start the conversation from there.
What are those conversations like with partners? That can't be an easy conversation when one partner identifies in the other that there could be a problem.
I would say that if you've met one person living with dementia, you've met one person living with dementia, and no two people's reactions are the same. I'm thinking of